The afternoon sun, too bright and innocent for the scene it illuminated, cast long, distorted shadows across the manicured lawn of a house on Maple Avenue. A lone police cruiser idled at the curb, its blue and red lights silent and still. It was a picture of suburban calm, but for the rookie officer, Jake, who stood with his hand on the car door, the quiet was a suffocating weight. His partner, Detective Miller, a man whose face was etched with a decade of similar calls, simply stared at the house. He didn't need the flashing lights or the wailing sirens to know what lay inside. The stillness itself was the first sign. Dispatch said it was a welfare check. Jake began, his voice barely a whisper, as if a louder tone might shatter the fragile peace. No forced entry, no signs of a struggle, Miller grunted, his gaze fixed on the perfectly symmetrical front door. They never do, not at first. The ugliness is always on the inside, Jake. It's always been waiting. His words were heavy, a grim philosophy born from too many closed cases. He pulled a key from a small evidence bag, its shiny metal a stark contrast to the faded, worn plastic. The neighbor found this. The husband's said he dropped it on his way out this morning. As Miller turned the key in the lock, the sound was unnaturally loud in the silence. The door swung inward, revealing a dimly lit hallway. The air inside was cool, stale, and smelled of lemon polish and something else. A metallic tang that made Jake's stomach clench. The house was immaculate. A coat lay neatly folded on a chair. A pair of shoes sat side by side on a mat, and the only sound was the faint hum of a refrigerator. It was a home designed for a life that was now utterly, horribly absent. The officers stepped inside, leaving the sun and the quiet suburban street behind them, entering a darkness that had been quietly waiting. Chapter 2. The Whispers of the Past. As Jake moved further into the living room, his boots felt sacrilegious on the plush cream carpet. Everything was meticulously arranged, a stage set for a life of quiet contentment. A cashmere throw was artfully draped over a leather armchair, and a half-finished glass of red wine sat on a coaster by its side, a perfect crimson stain of lipstick on the rim. On a side table, a photo album was left open, revealing a smiling couple, arms wrapped tightly around each other on a sun-drenched beach. Mark, from the initial report, had a boyish grin. She, Sarah, looked radiant, her eyes full of unguarded joy. "Looks like they had a good life," Jake murmured, the words feeling hollow. He was trying to reconcile the warmth of these frozen moments with the cold dread seeping from the walls. He saw a life interrupted mid-sip, a memory left open for a revisiting that would never come. But Miller wasn't looking at the photos. His eyes, trained by years of seeing beyond domestic veneers, swept the room with a methodical coldness. He bypassed the obvious signs of life, the books stacked on the coffee table, the keys in a ceramic bowl by the door. He was hunting for the inconsistencies, the small, deliberate details that screamed of an outside influence. His gaze drifted past the television, over the polished furniture, and snagged on the mantelpiece above the unlit fireplace. It was a clean, polished slab of oak, adorned with nothing but a silver-framed clock and, to its left, a single pristine white flower in a slender glass vase. A white lily. Miller's breath caught in his throat, a sharp, painful intake of air. It was impossible. He was instantly transported back a decade, standing in another silent house across town. The same cloying, funereal scent of lilies heavy in the air, the same lone flower placed like a final, mocking signature on the victim's bedside table. The press had nicknamed him the Gardener, a killer he'd never caught, a ghost that had haunted every quiet moment of his career. This wasn't just a domestic scene gone tragically wrong. This was a message, a ghost from his past, resurrected in this perfect, silent house. "Jake!" Miller's voice was a harsh crack in the stillness, devoid of its earlier weariness and filled with a sudden, sharp-edged alarm. "Don't touch a damn thing. Get forensics on the line, now!" His eyes were locked on the flower, seeing not a home, but the beginning of a nightmare he knew all too well. The air in the house still held the metallic tang that had set Jake's nerves on edge. But for Detective Miller, it was the cloying scent of the lily that filled his every breath. He stood frozen, his mind a ghost of a decade ago, while Jake's bewildered voice broke through the haze. "Miller, what's wrong? What's the Gardener?" But Miller didn't answer. He was no longer in the present, no longer in this house. He was lost in a memory, a woman's face superimposed over the pristine silence of the crime scene, her terror a silent scream that only he could hear. It was a face he'd never seen, a life he'd never known. But in the stillness of the moment, he could feel its weight. The face belonged to Sarah. Hours earlier, she had stared into a reflection, not recognizing the woman who looked back. A stranger with a smile a little too wide, eyes a little too bright. She ran a hand over her flawless makeup, the mask she wore for the world for him. Her husband Mark was due home soon. She could hear his car crunching on the gravel outside, the familiar sound sending a jolt of anxiety through her. It wasn't the sound of a loving return. It was the start of an evening she had meticulously planned, every detail a desperate attempt to maintain a sense of order she no longer possessed. She slipped into the deep blue dress Mark loved, its fabric like a second skin. It was his favorite, the one she wore on their anniversaries, and tonight was no different. It was the anniversary of a different kind, a silent, painful milestone only she knew. She touched the silver locket she wore around her neck, its cool metal a small, comforting weight. Inside was a tiny, faded picture of her, and a girl she no longer spoke of. A ghost from her past. Sarah's past was a series of closed doors, locked and buried deep within her. But lately the locks had begun to rust. They rattled in the silence between her and Mark, a phantom presence that had slowly poisoned their intimacy. She had built her life with Mark on a foundation of carefully curated half-truths. Her trauma wasn't a secret she intended to hurt him with. It was a wound she believed could never heal, a part of herself too broken to share. She felt a profound loneliness, a chasm opening up between them, a space filled with the lies she told to protect him. The reflection in the mirror seemed to mock her, its perfect stillness a stark contrast to the storm raging inside. A single tear escaped, tracing a path through the careful foundation on her cheek, a crack in the veneer. A voice, small and fragile, whispered in her mind, "He won't understand." She dabbed at the tear and took a deep breath. She had to be perfect tonight. For him, for her, for the life they had. A phone call, its screen glowing with the contact name Mark, sat on the coffee table. It belonged to the veteran detective Miller, who hadn't taken his eyes off the single white lily on the mantelpiece since he'd spotted it. The phone's silence was a stark contrast to the buzzing energy of the forensics team now swarming the house, their flashes illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. Jake stood by the front door, talking on the phone to his supervisor, his face a mask of confusion. He couldn't grasp the cold horror Miller saw in the room, the way a single flower could speak a language of violence and death. For Miller, the silence was a memory. The absence of sound was a presence, the echo of a conversation he had with the previous victim's family. Meanwhile, a week before the police arrived, Mark was sitting across from his oldest friend, Ben, at a dimly lit bar. The clinking of glasses and low murmur of conversation provided a backdrop for the unspoken tension between them. Mark swirled the ice in his glass, avoiding eye contact. He had always been the open, easygoing one in their friendship, but lately, a heavy cloak of secrecy had settled over him. "She's different, you know," he finally said, his voice a strained whisper. "Sarah. It feels like she's a million miles away, even when she's right next to me." Ben listened patiently, a familiar concern in his eyes. He had known Mark and Sarah as a couple for years, and their seemingly perfect life had always been a source of quiet envy. "Couples go through phases, man. You two will get through it." Mark shook his head, a wry, humorless smile on his lips. "This isn't a phase. I've been lying to her, about work, about money." He took a long gulp of his drink, the confession bitter on his tongue. He had always been the primary earner, the provider, and the fear of losing that had become an all-consuming monster. There was a big investment that went south. Lost everything, more than everything, actually. I've been taking out loans, trying to hide the debt. I've been so worried she'd find out, worried it would break her trust in me. I didn't even notice she was pulling away until she was gone. The lies had created an invisible wall between them, a chasm that his pride wouldn't let him bridge. The more he lied, the more Sarah retreated into herself, and the more he pushed, the further she seemed to slip away. Ben, shocked by the admission, could only stare. Have you tried talking to her? Just telling her the truth? Mark looked down at his hands, his knuckles white around the glass. I can't, not now. I've got something planned, a way to fix it. I just need a little more time. He left the bar soon after, the weight of his unshared truth feeling heavier than any lie. The lies, he now realized, were not just a means to protect her. They were a weapon of control, a way to maintain a power dynamic in their marriage that he was terrified of losing. He felt a cold resolve harden in his stomach. He was going to fix this, no matter the cost. His words hung in the air long after he had gone, an unspoken confession that held a different kind of horror. The truth, in Mark's mind, had become more dangerous than any secret. The silent house was now a whirlwind of activity, the forensics team moving like ghosts in white suits. Miller, however, remained rooted by the mantelpiece, his gaze still fixed on the white lily. The memory of the Gardner case, a ghost of a decade past, felt chillingly present. Jake, still shaken, held up his phone. Forensics just found their phones, sir. A few feet from each other like they were thrown. Sarah's is still on. Miller's attention shifted, his eyes now cold and sharp. The phones were no longer just evidence. They were a window into the final hours of a marriage and a puzzle piece in a much larger, darker narrative. Meanwhile, across the street, an interview was underway with a nosy neighbor. Mrs. Gable. She held a steaming mug of tea, her hands trembling slightly as she spoke to another officer. She had been the one to find the spare key, the one who had first felt the chilling silence emanating from the house. They seemed so happy, she whispered, her voice a mix of gossip and genuine sorrow. But a few nights ago I heard them arguing. I know you're not supposed to listen, but it was just so loud. Not shouting, you understand, but sharp, angry words I'd never heard from them. She offered a seemingly innocent detail. I saw Mark leave the house late that night, looking like a ghost. He was carrying a bag, one of those big leather ones he takes on business trips. The police had the phones now, and as the tech crime unit began their work, a series of text messages between Sarah's phone and a number saved only as D were uncovered. The messages were a slow descent into darkness, revealing a relationship built on manipulation and veiled threats. D. You know I'm only doing this because I love you. You need to tell him. It's for your own good, to set you free, Sarah. It's not for my good. You're scaring me. He will never understand. Understand what, Sarah? The truth? You're so good at burying it. Just like you did with me, Sarah. Stop, I can't do this. D, you have to. He's not the man you think he is. I know things about him. Things that would make you run. Let me help you, my love. The messages were a slow burn, a psychological cat-and-mouse game. Miller, looking over the technician's shoulder, felt the hairs on his arms rise. The dialogue was a sinister echo of the emotional manipulation he'd seen in other cases. It was a language of control, of someone subtly preying on a fragile mind. The last message from D was particularly chilling, an unsettling command veiled as concern. D, you know what you have to do to be free. Just remember I'm always watching, always here for you. The final message was a cold, calculated masterpiece of gaslighting, a final shove off the edge. This wasn't a lover's quarrel. It was a psychological battlefield. Coupled with the neighbor's testimony of Mark leaving with a bag, the messages hinted at a sinister plot, suggesting that both husband and wife were victims in a game orchestrated by a puppet master. The mystery deepened, hinting at a betrayal far greater than a simple affair. The seemingly perfect marriage was nothing but a facade, and the cracks were now spilling its ugliest secrets out into the light. The next piece of the puzzle, the identity of the mysterious D, was the key to unlocking the true horror of the scene. The cold, sterile light of the police precinct's interview room was a stark contrast to the shadowy messages on Sarah's phone. Miller's hunched form over a monitor resembled a vulture. He pointed at the screen. That number is an older landline, he said. It's a throwaway phone, registered to a post office box under a fake name, but the location pinged it to an old apartment building downtown. The same building, Jake, where Sarah lived 10 years ago, before she met Mark. A new, chilling hypothesis was forming. The killer wasn't just a ghost from Miller's past. He was a very real, very present figure from Sarah's. The name, The first clue to his identity was staring at them from the bottom of a decades-old police report. David. An old lover. Sarah had carried the ghost of David for 10 years, a secret she had buried deep in the past. She had met him during a tumultuous period in her life, a time of profound emotional fragility after a traumatic event. He had seemed like a savior then, a charming artist who saw the broken parts of her and promised to make them beautiful again. But his promises were as fragile as his art, and soon his affection had turned to a possessive, controlling obsession. He had been a master of emotional manipulation, a slow, insidious poison that had corroded her sense of self. When she finally found the courage to leave, she had moved away, changed her name, and built a new life. A life that was supposed to be free of him. She had never told Mark about the dark chapter of her past. She couldn't because the memory even now felt too heavy to share. But David hadn't forgotten. He'd found her, like a predator returning to the hunt. The texts were proof. He'd been watching her, studying her, finding the cracks in her seemingly perfect marriage. He knew about her fears, her vulnerabilities, her loneliness. He had expertly used her past trauma as a weapon against her, and the words so full of fake concern were designed to isolate her, to turn her against the only man she had in the world. He was still trying to exert control from a distance, just as he had so many years ago. He was her personal gardener, a man who had planted the seeds of her destruction years before. The police now had a name and a new motive. The crime wasn't a domestic tragedy born of betrayal, but a twisted act of vengeance orchestrated by a third party. The scene that had once seemed to be the conclusion of a tragic love story was now the opening act of something much darker. The question was no longer who had done it, but how. What did David know about Mark that could drive Sarah to the edge? The name David hung in the air like a ghost, a name from the past that suddenly made the present terrifyingly clear. For Miller, it was the final, devastating puzzle piece. A third party, a manipulator, a man who had stalked his victim for a decade and finally found his moment. The investigation was no longer about a murder. It was about the slow, deliberate psychological torture that had led to it. As the police began their search for David, Miller's mind, however, kept returning to Mark, the husband. He was the one who had lied, the one who had driven a wedge between himself and his wife. He was no victim, and Miller had a feeling his lies were even darker than they appeared. A month before the crime, Mark sat hunched over his laptop at a late-night cafe, a cold coffee long forgotten. His face was pale, drawn, a stark contrast to the confident man he usually was. Across from him sat his colleague, a sleek, ambitious man named Robert. Mark had always considered Robert a rival, but now he was a reluctant confidant. "He's going to find out," Mark whispered, his voice laced with panic. "The auditors are coming. They'll see the numbers, see the money I took." Robert's expression was cold, clinical. "The money you took, Mark, or the money you borrowed to keep your crumbling life together?" There was no sympathy in his voice, only a calculated amusement. The truth was, Mark's desperation was a weapon Robert intended to use. Mark hadn't just lost a client's investment. He had been siphoning company funds, a quiet, growing theft to cover the massive debt he had amassed. He was a professional success story on the verge of a catastrophic collapse, and he had made his colleague an unwitting accomplice. He'd promised Robert a massive cut from his next big deal in exchange for his silence. "I have to get it back," Mark said, his voice hardening with a dangerous resolve. "Before Sarah finds out. She thinks I'm going to a conference next week, but I'm going to meet with a contact. Final bet to get it all back, to fix everything." The lies he told his wife were not just to hide his financial ruin, but to conceal the deep, morally compromising hole he had dug for himself. It wasn't about a simple financial mistake anymore. It was about outright theft. He was so consumed by his own web of lies, he couldn't see the danger his wife was in. He had betrayed her trust long before any third party came into the picture. His silence a weapon as sharp as any blade. Back in the present, forensics found a burner phone hidden in a hollowed-out book on Mark's side of the bed. It contained texts to his colleague, and more chillingly, a series of messages to an unknown number about a meeting on the night of the crime, a time-stamped alibi. The messages detailed a plan to take out a new insurance policy on Sarah, a policy worth millions. Mark hadn't just been lying about his finances. He had been planning something far worse. The motive wasn't about love, but about cold, hard cash. The horror of the scene now had a sickeningly familiar and far more sinister root. The burner phone lay on the evidence table, its contents a cold, damning indictment of Mark's duplicity. Miller had been right. The crime was more complex, a sinister blend of personal betrayal and professional fraud. But the two officers hadn't found the elusive David yet, the puppet master pulling the strings. The truth was unraveling, but not in the way they'd expected. The horror was two-sided. While Mark's lies became clearer, so did Sarah's fragility. And the investigation now centered on a search for her family. They needed to understand the woman behind the perfect smile, the one who had so carefully concealed her scars. The name of her only living relative, a reclusive older sister, was all they had to go on. The sister Eliza lived alone in a small, cluttered apartment on the edge of town, a woman whose face held a permanent expression of sorrow. She was hesitant at first, but Miller's quiet persistence eventually broke through her defenses. Sarah was always fragile, she admitted, her voice thin and reedy. After what happened to us when we were kids, she never really recovered. Eliza reluctantly revealed a past trauma that had deeply scarred them both. It was a shared secret, a violent home life that they had tried to outrun. While Eliza had learned to cope, Sarah had developed a profound sense of self-loathing, a tendency toward self-destruction. She'd always sought out relationships that mirrored the control and chaos of her childhood. The narration shifted, delving into the psyche of both spouses. Sarah had sought a perfect life with Mark as a shield, a carefully constructed illusion of normalcy to hide her brokenness. She had seen him as a savior, but his lies about the debt were, in her mind, a betrayal that echoed the deceptions of her past. She had felt her world crumble, not just because of Mark's deceit, but because it validated her darkest fears, that she was unworthy of love, that every relationship was destined to fail. The text from D had merely preyed on a vulnerability that already existed. Mark, on the other hand, had been driven by a different kind of darkness, a desperate need to maintain power and control. His web of lies wasn't about protecting his wife, but about preserving his own ego, his own image of himself as a successful provider. He had been so consumed by his fear of failure, he had become blind to his wife's pain, his own desperation pushing him to a point of no return. The lies had created an emotional vacuum between them, a silent space where a marriage had once been, allowing a predator to slip in and turn their private hell into a public tragedy. The full extent of their psychological descent was now visible. What happened on the night of the crime was no longer a mystery. It was the inevitable, devastating conclusion to two lives built on secrets. The police now had two narratives: Mark's cold, calculating betrayal, and Sarah's descent into psychological despair, manipulated by a ghost from her past. The two stories, so separate at first, finally merged into one horrifying moment. The truth of what happened in that perfect silent house wasn't a single act, but the culmination of a decade of lies. The air in the house was thick with unspoken words, a tangible weight that pressed down on Sarah. Outside, a late-night storm raged, the wind a mournful howl, the rain a rhythmic assault against the windows. Inside, the silence was broken by the quiet drip of a leak from an old pipe, a sound that drove Sarah mad. She stood by the fireplace, her body trembling, a glass of half-empty wine in her hand. Across the room, Mark's face was a mask of cold fury. His secret was out, his lies exposed. "You took it all," she accused, her voice cracking, her eyes wild with a pain that went beyond the money. "You betrayed me. Just like he did. I was trying to fix it." Mark roared back, his voice thick with a desperate, pathetic plea. "It was the only way. You were so gone, so lost in your own world. I was saving us." "Saving us?" She laughed, a bitter, hollow sound. "You were going to kill me, weren't you? For the money?" The accusation hung in the air, a final poisoned dart. His face, for the first time, showed a flicker of real terror, not for himself, but for what he had become. The silent, emotional storm broke, a single violent act culminating in a final, horrifying scene. The darkness that had been quietly waiting for them both was now fully present, leaving behind a silence far more profound than the one the police had found. The only question now was how to tell the world the truth. The quiet house on Maple Avenue was now just a crime scene number. The forensics team had cleared out. The investigators had gone. And all that remained were the yellow ribbons flapping gently in the wind, a silent testament to the horror that had unfolded inside. The press conference was swift and somber. Detective Miller, his face grim, stood at the podium and laid out the facts. Mark and Sarah's story was no longer a mystery, but a public tragedy. The details of Mark's financial fraud, his plan to collect on the insurance policy, and Sarah's past trauma with her old lover, David, were all laid bare. The police had finally found David in another state, a master manipulator who had been watching their lives from afar, stoking Sarah's paranoia with his anonymous threats and fueling her emotional instability. It was a betrayal within a betrayal, a story with no hero, only victims. The narration shifted, a final poignant reflection on the human heart and its capacity for self-deception. The crime wasn't a sudden act of madness, but the inevitable result of two people building a life on a foundation of lies. Mark, so afraid of losing his image of success, and Sarah, so terrified of revealing her past, had both chosen to live in a silent world of secrets. Their marriage, a beautiful facade to the outside world, was, in reality, a fragile prison. The darkness that had consumed them was not a singular event, but a slow-growing cancer, nurtured by the unspoken truths they refused to face. The story ended with a long, haunting shot of the empty house. The afternoon sun, once again, cast long shadows across the front door. But this time, the stillness was absolute. The house stood as a monument to what happens when love is not enough, when past sins resurface, and when the price of keeping a secret becomes the ultimate cost.